Today on Kanpai Planet, we're going to answer a question that has puzzled many a visitor to the land of the rising sun. What the actual is Shochu? We're going to take a look at what Shochu is, what Shochu is not, why few have heard of it outside Japan, and how that's changing, and why you need to know. We're also going to be busting a few myths along the way. But let's start with what Shochu is. Shochu is Japan's indigenous spirit. Sounds simple, right? Well, this is where things get a little wild. You see, Honkaku Shochu, or authentic Shochu, the premium Shochu that you should be drinking, can be fermented from 53 ingredients or ingredient families as defined by the alcohol definition controlling tax authorities. These include water chestnuts, milk, kelp, whey powder, silver vine, aloe, sake, pumpkin, and carrots. And I didn't just pluck all of those out of my arse, although cactus is another one of those 53. Insane ingredients notwithstanding, Shochu is typically distilled from either rice, barley, sweet potatoes, buckwheat, or Kokuto sugar. All Honkaku Shochu is made in a pot still, and over 99.99% of it is single distilled, which means that its taste is primarily determined by that underlying main ingredient whose flavour is preserved by that single distillation. The majority of Shochu in Japan is bottled at 25% ABV, so it's generally milder than other spirits like whiskey or vodka or gin, although legally it can be bottled at up to 44.9%. The versatility of Shochu is not just in how it's made, it has versatile serving styles too. Straight, on the rocks, with cold room temperature or hot water, and in a highball. Most of what I've mentioned applies equally to awamori, the Okinawan cousin of Shochu, although differences include the fact that awamori must be made from rice and is most often bottled at 30% ABV. So far, we've talked about the good stuff. Some Shochu is not made to Honkaku specifications, and that is called Koroi Shochu, which is distilled multiple times, giving it a clear colour, milder scent, and neutral taste. Essentially, ethanol. It's a cheap izakaya cocktail backbone used in chuhais. There, I've mentioned it.
Now let us never speak of it again.
So, that's what Shochu is. Let's move on to what Shochu is not. Shochu is not Nihonshu. Nihonshu, more commonly known overseas as Japanese sake, is exclusively made from rice and is brewed, not distilled. But both being indigenous Japanese drinks, they share the fact that they are both made with koji, Japan's national mold, which is responsible for the conversion of starch to sugar in the fermentation process. Honkaku Shochu is not Japanese vodka, the typical single distillation of Honkaku Shochu contrasting with the multiple distillation many vodka brands are proud of. Vodkas are typically intended to taste of nothing, providing an alcoholic neutral base for cocktails. Shochu tastes of something, and that something is derived from the main fermentable ingredient. But the one that I have to stress is that Japanese Shochu is definitely not Korean soju. Green bottle soju is simply an industrial spirit that is adulterated with artificial sweeteners. It's designed for cheap and speedy production and consumption, where in contrast, Honkaku Shochu must be pot distilled and additives are never allowed. By the way, Shochu is not pronounced Sochu or Soshu. Both H's are required. The word in Japanese is Shochu, but it's anglicized to Shochu, like Shogun or this guy.
Shohei! And Shohei Ohtani is a home run!
Given I've just raved about what it is and what it isn't, why have few heard of Shochu outside Japan? Given that sake is having a moment worldwide, with exports generally growing and breweries opening up overseas, you'd expect the same of Shochu. Well, the motivation wasn't there because domestic Shochu sales have been higher than sake sales since the start of the millennium, so there was less need to drive exports and spread the word about Shochu worldwide. Market literacy is another issue where there are a number of well-recognized sake experts out there There are few shochu ones and very little non-Japanese language literature about and support for the drink. And what little is exported costs, well, a lot. It's completely understandable that consumers might balk at a 25% ABV clear spirit that they've never heard of when the ask is upwards of $55 a bottle that sits next to a new mezcal or decently proofed bourbon commanding half the price. Speaking of proof, shochu does suffer somewhat from that traditional ABV of 25%. It sits somewhere between the 15% range of wine and sake and the 40% range of most Western spirits, so people often don't know what to do with it. More confusion was spread by a law that allowed products labeled soju, remember that Korean drink, that were 24% ABV or lower to be sold on a beer and wine license in California and New York State. Unfortunately, many large Japanese shochu makers began exporting mislabeled product to the US in order to sell a few cases to izakaya and sushi joints. But the bottles were distributed nationwide, so you may well have drunk shochu thinking it's soju, or more likely avoided shochu thinking it's soju. As a result, generations of Americans have no idea that there is a difference between Japanese shochu and Korean soju. Considering the fact that shochu in all its forms is Japan's most popular spirit, there are actually relatively few industry disruptors doing innovative things. For example, Keisuke Hashimoto, founder of independent bottler Shochu X, has said in interviews that one of the worst things about the shochu industry is that it is difficult for newcomers to enter. If it's not the barriers to entry obstructing innovations, it's the rules. Shochu currently can't be bottled as is with cask-derived colour. A spectrophotometer is used to measure the absorbance value, which needs to be 0.08 or lower. I'm not making this up. It's the guys, as always, at the National Tax Agency who are mandating this. And this was introduced as a concession during the international trade negotiations of the mid-80s when the European community, especially the UK, was pushing Japan hard to normalise the disparities in tax regulation between shochu and whiskey. So shochu's had the deck stacked against it. But why and how is this now changing? In 2014, the world's first dual-certified shochu sommelier, Christopher Pellegrini, published the Shochu Handbook, which was, incredibly, the first English-language book dedicated to the spirit. That began a slow still slow, but steady growth in international awareness of shochu. Fast forward to the COVID pandemic, during which many people had time on their hands, which some used to learn new things, mainly about drinks, including shochu, and that interest is continuing to gain momentum, while mezcal simultaneously provided an assist by teaching tipplers that clear spirits can be cool. That interest is all well and good, but it's sales we ultimately need. Luckily, companies such as Honkaku Spirits, Ginza Berlin, and Nankai are bringing shochu to the world, and the number of quality shochu brands available in the US and Europe has gone through the roof. Internationally, at least, the laws have changed to help shochu. Remember the fraudulently mislabeled shochu in the US? Well, that law changed in New York State in 2022 and in California in 2023. The Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association has been doing its part. It's one of the S's in its name after all, devoting more of its budget to promoting shochu, including running cocktail competitions in both the US and the UK. And it's worth entering them. The winners of these are flown to Japan to tour Kyushu, shochu's heartland. Samuel Bolton's book about the art of koji cocktails, published in 2023, is another sign of increasing interest from cocktail makers. Some companies are addressing the ABV issue head-on. For example, Hamada Shizo launched their 25% ABV Dayame product in September 2018. In July 2021, they started exporting Dayame 40, a higher proof variant with, you guessed it, 40% ABV to expand its potential as a cocktail ingredient. But conversely, the growing interest in lower non-alcohol drinks means that even standard 25% ABV expressions have growing utility as cocktail modifiers. And to try to draw in whiskey drinkers, cask-aged shochu is on the rise, despite those colour limits I mentioned earlier. Still a relatively small market domestically, but it's only going to increase its global appeal, and hopefully this brings more attention to the traditional clay pot aged shochu, which is much loved in Japan. So, if you have interest in Japanese sake or Japanese whiskey, you are missing out by not giving Honkaku Shochu a try. Get on board the shochu train now. It really does exist. With so much variety out there, there's a shochu for everyone. You won't regret it. Until next time, Kanpai.